Well, it's such an honor to be here, and it's great to see you, and this is a great opportunity for us to be able to thank you so much for what you do, for providing the substance that you do, and for telling the stories about the works that you curate and the role that you play in the nation. And it's so much fun to be here with Bro, my partner in, I'm not going to say crime because I don't want the word crime associated with the humanities or the arts or the federal government, but it's so fun to be here again with my colleague. You used to call it the twins separated at birth or something like that. And so thank you for giving us this opportunity to join you today. And we're going to just talk about some of the things that we both experienced when we were at the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. And then I believe we'll also leave some time at the end for any questions that you want to ask. So, Bro, great to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Thanks. And you traveled a lot when you were at the National Endowment for the Humanities. What did you see? Any patterns, any trends? What did you learn?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. As Jane said, we spent a lot of time at NEH and NEA traveling around the country and visiting museums, and it's wonderful to be back in the company of people who work in those museums and really push them forward. So thank you for the invitation. I got to NEH with a great deal of experience in the academic humanities. I was trained as a humanist. I taught for a while as a humanist, and then as a college president, I spent a lot of time working in the academic program and with humanists across the range of humanities concerns in the university. But what really startled me when I got to NEH was to find out how much there was and is beyond the university, beyond the academy, with respect to humanities work. And it was a revelation that sticks with me still. I think that it's true to say that the humanities community outside the academy is larger, more diverse, more complicated than the humanities communities inside the university. That's not a criticism of universities, but it's a true statement to make. The museum community is a good example of this in this country, is enormous, as you all know, because you work in the middle of it. More people, I think, go to museums every year, this is a true statement, than go to professional sporting events and theme parks combined. It's an enormous enterprise, and it touches many, many millions of people. And it touches them in ways that the academic humanities, as brilliant and wonderful as they are, do not, and really in some senses cannot. So it was really finding that community, which also includes for NEH libraries, historic sites, cultural organizations of all kinds, all over the country. It was discovering that big, impressive humanities community that was the most startling thing that I experienced. Not exactly the disappointment side, but the worrisome side, is I also got to travel a lot to the academic humanities communities, universities and colleges all over the country. And as all of you know, the challenges, the pressure on humanities in those institutions is very real, and it's not getting better. So there are huge issues among humanists and the humanities disciplines and workers across the country about how we continue to revitalize these disciplines and make them speak to contemporary circumstances in the United States in a new way. Most of you were probably trained in art historical institutions and programs, so you know how important a vibrant humanities community is in the university community, because it supplies places like this with curators who do the essential work of museums. So it was a very powerful impression, mixed in that way, but the really exciting part was getting out of the academic world and into this other vast terrain. How about you? You had a similar kind of exposure, but you had been more, I would say, in the middle of the performing arts community than I had been in this other humanities community. So what was the, sort of as you look back on it now, the big arc of your time at NEA?
Well, in terms of the traveling, and a lot of the patterns that we saw was an expansion where it seemed like it used to be first of all, one of the things that was remarkable was the arts are everywhere. And so dispelling this perception that the arts are only on the coasts or they're only in certain places and they're bereft in other places. There are arts that are thriving, they're substantive, and they're happening in so many different ways everywhere. And so we can celebrate that. The other pattern that we found when we traveled is that they were expanding. So it used to be, my experience of the arts was that there were final products, performances, exhibitions, readings, acting, but that final product seemed to be the most important. And they're still there, and it's important, but there was an expansion of a both and instead of just either or. And the process, the creative process, the ways people were touched by the arts, it wasn't just only artists who knew the product, but there were people who were not artists who were being connected to the arts. So it was expanding the breadth of those who participated in the arts, artists, those who are not in the arts. That seems to be happening across the nation, finding ways to connect the arts, not only for the beauty and the sake of the arts themselves, but also in other ways, including connecting to the non-arts. What did you find in terms of, and here's a question that we were asked a lot, that we learned, what did you find in terms of the question, how would you measure success in the humanities and the arts?
We thought a lot about that, and we talked a lot about that, and that was kind of always on our minds. We were making grants, we were trying to figure out, what kinds of grants have impact? How do they have impact? Why do they have impact? And it wasn't always easy to do that. People think that, well, at least if you're in the fundraising mode, as I was for so many years, you imagine that giving away money is easy. It's not easy. And I think the hardest part about it is assessing what you're doing. And our organizations were making so many grants across the year, and we spent so much time making those grants that it was very difficult to back up and assess what we were doing. So I think assessment and knowing about impact and trying to gauge where you can have impact was a big issue. The other big issue, for me at least, was NEH was very, very good at responding to what they saw as motion and momentum and interest in the fields. The people who work there are enormously talented, well-trained, and observant about what's going on. What I was equally interested in, even as I had to be interested in that, was how do we anticipate the future? Where are the humanities going? Where are museums, for example, going? And how do we use the leverage of the funding that NEA and NEH were getting away as a way of prompting institutions to go in certain kinds of directions? Anne was talking very interestingly about diversity. As some of you know, the Mellon Foundation has been leading, in some sense, that movement by energizing the community around diversity with respect to its funding. It was hard at NEH, given that it was a governmental organization, to always remind people that we need to be leading the humanities community. We need to be causing change as much as we're reacting to change. That was a great challenge. That was very difficult, but it was also very important, and it was part of the work that I value the most. How about at NEA? I mean, I know you must have had some of the same issues, both in terms of what the organization was very good at and other things that it might not have been as good at.
Well, certainly we ask the same questions in terms of where do we want to make the impact. But one of the things that I learned through my time at the National Endowment for the Arts, and I still take with that today, and I still use it even to this very day, is I came away with 4 measures of success that would allow the arts to be celebrated across the nation, and I use them now. And one of them is something that we've always measured, and that's the economic value. How many tickets did you sell? How much money did you raise? And how many people attended, and things like that. That's always been there, or it's been there for a long time. But the three measures of success that I've now, in my mind, added to projects are broadening, deepening, and diversifying. And by that I mean, you could almost take those three and put an overlay of those three extra success measures on any project. Broadening may be broadening the number of people who come in or the different types, but broadening your audiences, it may be broadening your exhibits, it may be whatever you want to make it. It may be broadening your donors. Deepening, to me, meant some version of if you participated in one exhibition on, and I'm making this up as I go, Frida Kahlo, it might be deepening the understanding and going even deeper than you had before. Diversifying can mean everything from different audiences to different types of donors, different types of programs that hadn't been done before. But when I was able to use the success measures of broadening, deepening, diversifying, and the economic measure, which is very important, it's got to keep us alive. Those four meant to me, it wasn't just about the final product. It didn't mean that it was just about putting everything in categories about success means how many people showed up. What it really meant was what you do so well, and museums do it so well. They are in there to create a culture and environment in the community where the arts, where the humanities can thrive, and where the community can thrive by being connected to it. So to me, everybody won by doing that.
I guess one thing your remark prompts me to think about and mention, and again, Anne talked about it, I thought very movingly, is that while I was at NEH, it was really a fruitful, interesting, powerfully invigorating time with respect to what museums were doing and are doing, and how NEH could help museums do what they had to do, what they should be doing, with respect to the changes that you all are going through, that you know you're going through. So we spent a lot of time, particularly in the public programs division, and some of you might have benefited from some of these grants, thinking about this huge question of how museums now connect their publics in new ways, how they define their publics in new ways, how they curate for publics in new ways, and how they engage communities. This is a hugely mobile, dynamic, interesting, important, and somewhat vexing question. And you all are right in the middle of it. We were doing our best to find examples where museums were engaging their communities in new and very innovative ways, and were creating new kinds of curatorial possibilities with respect to how the collections are used, and how they speak not just inside the walls of the museum, but outside the walls of the museum. So we were doing our best to meet you where you were and are with respect to that enormously important question, which is probably the most important question that museums are facing now. And it's particularly important for a museum like this one. I mean, the Met, the Louvre, you know, they kind of live in a different world, but most museums live in this community context that Anne was talking about. So finding a way to help museums do that work was really very near the top of the list for us.
You know, one of the things that you said really leads to the question of, not the question, but the notion that curators are leaders. And it's not just left to a board chair or an administrator, but at the heart of finding what the context and the stories about the substance that you're working on, the projects, that you're leading us all to learn more and be connected. So what about leadership in the arts and the humanities nowadays? Is it different? What does leadership look like when it comes to the arts and humanities?
It's a small question. Well, I think some of the conversation already this morning has been very much about leadership. the diversity issue in question, the challenges that cultural institutions are facing, is in great part about leadership, and I thought spoke very movingly to that. In the humanities, in addition to these questions that apply particularly to museums, the humanities are in, as I said, a state of crisis is not a word that motivates people very positively anymore, but under very considerable pressure across the country, particularly in the academy. And leadership now really, I think, is speaking to those conditions and how the humanities renew themselves to become relevant. That's an old-fashioned word, but with new meanings, I think. How humanities teachers, writers, scholars, disciplines speak to the world in new ways, because the old ways are not speaking as clearly and as well as we want. And so we need to find new ways of engaging the world around us through the humanities that persuade people, again, of their relevance. And it's a tough time, right? So we live in this culture that is mesmerized by technological things, disciplines, ways of knowing the world. And that is also hooked to that enormously important economic engine of the way contemporary capitalism works. So it may be an unfair situation, but it's the situation we have, and we have to make sense of it. So I think leadership in the humanities has to take that on in a very significant way. And it's not just for the deans of colleges and universities to do that. It's not just for the heads of museums to do that. It's for curators. I consider you the sort of the faculty of museums, as the faculty of a university, also have to take this on and think about their teaching, their research, the way they engage the humanities with their students and in the public in new ways. So leadership, I think, it's a time when leadership needs to be distributed, but also very imaginative.
I am so energized by the thought of us being leaders in the arts and humanities. With whatever role we have, whatever job description we have, we talk about being in complex conditions, and we talk about issues arising and what is surrounding us and what do we need to either react to or respond to. But when I look at all the different industries and all the different sectors, arts, humanities, non-arts, non-humanities, everything, I really think this is our time for the arts and the humanities to be the leaders in the communities. Why? Because there's never been a better time for doing, first of all, what you do so well, and what Ann Pasternak mentioned also before we started talking, and that is you listen. And you don't just listen, you listen with the nuances and for the nuances, because you're trained to pay attention to them. Most people know the difference between, say, a fortissimo and a pianissimo, loud and quiet. But not everybody knows the difference between moderately loud and medium loud. And there are all kinds of nuances in between, and those are the skills that you do when you listen, when you're listening to the community, and when you're telling somebody, instead of saying, this is what you should be liking, you're talking about setting a context and telling the stories of something because you paid attention to what they wanted to hear. You paid attention to what they were saying. And so it is less about force-fitting somebody to be a certain way and much more about expanding people to feel like they're in a both-and situation. It can be this and that. That's the beauty of the arts and humanities. So that's how we can be leaders. However that translates into what you do every day, I think this is our time to be the leaders.
We also, didn't we, had a lot of opportunities to observe the way that arts and humanities organizations in small and medium-sized communities are also in a position to provide a lot of leadership. Coming from Waterville, Maine, where I came from at Colby before NEH, I knew a lot about how the cultural sector impacted the economic fortunes of the communities. These are places where big industries have left long ago, where there isn't much left except cultural organizations colleges and universities, hospitals. So these places matter now in certain communities in ways that I didn't appreciate previously, but I did see it up close and personal in Waterville. But I think both of us, in traveling around the country, saw these museums and libraries, arts organizations, performing arts organizations, taking on a significance in their communities and potentially leadership roles in their communities, which has not typically been the case, or it was not the case during the time when the American economy was working in very different ways. So that was eye-opening, I would say, and we talked about it a lot in front of members of Congress particularly. And it was interesting to me that they understood it. They understood that argument, that there was an economic impact to these organizations. And I know you spent a lot of time, and NEA spent a lot of time working on that as well.
We did, and we worked a lot on trying to help people understand that the arts belong to everybody. They weren't just segmented for some people at the exclusion of others, but it was really more about the ways people connected and help them feel like they belong. It sort of segues into how did you decide to go into the humanities? Krista read your wonderful set of accomplishments, but what inside made you feel like this was more touching to you than wanting to be in some other sector?
It's a very long story.
Okay.
As the introduction mentioned, I was a philosophy student and major, and then I had a PhD in philosophy, sort of the history of consciousness, which was yet another thing. But my journey in the humanities really started when I was in the Army, and it was in the pretty rough circumstances of being in the military in 1966 to 1969 that made me think about things in a different way and made me curious in a way that I'd never been before. And it especially raised questions for me about meaning and how you make sense, make meaning out of things that don't seem to have a lot of meaning on the surface. So making sense of experience, making meaning from experience was to me a kind of an existential project, and it made me very interested and curious in philosophy, about philosophy, which led to other kinds of humanities engagements, and I had the good fortune to attend a sort of an interdisciplinary graduate program in the humanities, and that really opened up my world in a hugely important way. But it's the reason that I think, as we talk now about the humanities and the arts, that we have to come back and return to these ways in which these ways of thinking about the world speak to experience, to people's experiences. And Anne mentioned some things that were happening here that are very much in that mode. There are many, many others, and many institutions are doing wonderful work in this, but we shouldn't forget how much these ways of engaging the world, thinking about the world, imagining the world, matter with respect to how we understand and cope with our own experiences. And I don't mean just our individual experiences, our idiosyncratic experiences, but our experiences as a nation, which was a perspective that we were able to have at NEH. Both NEA and NEH, for example, did an enormous amount of work programming and funding for programming on veterans issues. And you could really see and understand immediately the impact that this work had in the lives of individuals who are trying to come to terms with some very serious and difficult things. The arts and the humanities speak to that. And they are the only modalities, really, that speak to that in the way that is necessary. You, I know, spent a lot of time thinking about that particular kind of programming.
It means a lot to me personally, having parents who met each other in the United States, but they were from the beautiful country of China. My mother was a teenager when she left China as She escaped. It was during the change of the government, during the time it was very oppressive, violent, lots of persecution. And she left on her own. Well, her parents snuck her out, and she left on her own to get on a train without any documents. Took 8 days to get out, took 141 interrogations that she managed to escape. She put 8 pairs of underwear on, one over the other, didn't carry any luggage or suitcases because she didn't want to look conspicuous. They cut off all communication with each other because she knew that the family who's left behind would be persecuted if they found out that a child was missing. So she made it out and ultimately came to the United States, where she met my father, but also attended school. And I was born in Arkansas, and when there were no Chinese people in Arkansas back then, it's a long time ago. And really it was the arts that allowed me to be able to make sense of my world, which was anything but linear. And while direct and usual, typical everyday conversations require a linearity when you're trying to use one word into the next and leading into whatever you're trying to get across. But I didn't have that condition because my parents spoke Mandarin and I spoke English at school, and my parents liked mung bean noodles and I had mashed potatoes, and there was just nothing that was a match. And I learned to be very comfortable in that ambiguity. But what I really learned is that there was another language in the arts and the humanities, the nuances. I'm keenly sensitive to nuances because that's how I paid attention to the worlds of the different cultures combining together. And so for me, the arts have saved me. They've allowed me to understand that the context and the conditions around me I can pay attention to, but what more is that I can tell the stories and to communicate in ways more beyond just the direct, linear, everyday conversations, which you still need, but we're depriving ourselves from a far more expansive way of communicating without the arts and the humanities. Again, it's our time to really be the ones in the community to send out the message that there's another way we can be and another way we can envision. So that's what my mother taught me too, because she taught me that it really doesn't matter so much where you are. You can have everything around you condition-wise not be anything that you want. You can have to have a start a new life because everything that you've loved and has been lost, and you make your life wherever you are. So because we're in the humanities and because we're in the arts, we get to envision when everybody else is stuck and they don't know how to envision. And they would say, I don't know how to do this, it's never been done before. You're drooling because you've got a blank canvas. And you get to say, we get to create with less restrictions because there's nothing around here that's keeping me saying, well, it has to be this way, it's always been this way. So we get to envision, we get to be the leaders. And now I think that all of the orbits that I was born into at the same time are a gift, but it's because of the arts that helped.
You know, that bit of memory prompts me to say that, and I think you came to the same conclusion I did at any age, that in defending arts and humanities education, which our agencies were involved a lot in doing, and both arts and humanities are under pressure in all educational settings, particularly primary and secondary school settings. We've been afraid to talk about, or we've been shy in talking about the pragmatic impact, the practical impact of the arts and humanities. And I think we got to get over that. We have to make our own case for the pragmatic utility of these modalities of life and thinking as powerful tools in, as you put it beautifully, in making sense of your own experience. I don't think we should be afraid of that. I think we should just embrace that and find a language to talk about the utility of these modes of thinking and being that addresses that issue. We've been shy about that. Certainly in the education community, we've been shy.
You know, I was trained in a conservatory setting even though I went to a university, it was the mindset of conservatory, certainly in the music training, and actually in the visual arts as well. But one of the things that I was trained back then was that if I was able to sequester myself, say in a practice room or in a studio, that I would not be tainted by anybody else, and I would be able to keep the authenticity of my own self without being pulled to react or even be tempted to be commercial. And I love that because I don't want to be pulled to other things. I want to be able to be authentic no matter where I am. And so I kept that part. But I've learned over the years in my own training and my own experiences that it doesn't have to be this versus that. And so I never wanted to be saying things like I wanted to be pragmatic at the expense of losing the fact that I could express myself so in the presence of beauty, and that could just be moved only surely for the sake of beauty itself. I still am that way, but I've now learned that it isn't one versus the other, it is both and. I get to express myself, I get to appreciate art for its beauty, I get to connect art into the community, I get to figure out how to communicate, all because of the arts. So for me, I would absolutely say to you, absolutely that's true. It can be both and. It doesn't have to be either or.
We're doing a lot of talking. How about, I'd like to answer some of your questions. There's a microphone going around, and there's a question right there.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much for a really interesting conversation and a really learning experience. I have a question that I guess dogs me every morning when I wake up and I put on National Public Radio. And it's really for Dr. Adams to say, how should we see in terms of humanities education, how do we deal with the attacks on the press?
And did you see his socks?
These are NPR socks.
I didn't know this before.
Oh, wow. There's so much to say about that. And so much we still don't know about it and understand about it. But I think it's of a piece with some of the skepticism that's been aimed not just at the press and the media, but at the university as well. I was looking at some numbers the other day about public opinion polls, for what they're worth, about what the American people think about the American university. And it's really alarming. It's worrisome to see how much skepticism and, I don't know, positive active disliking there is out in the world, out in the American world, for this part. And I think it's connected to the attacks on the press, because it follows that anxiety about elites, about cultural elites. So the attack or the offensive against cultural elites sweeps across many, many different kinds of institutions in American life, including the media and including college and university world and other expressions of elite culture, including museums, I would also say. Though, and you have a much more immediate connection in some way with communities because of where you are and what you do and how you engage them already. So I think that's good. That's an advantage in all of this. But this breaking down of elite, non-elite culture, Anne mentioned that as well, and the renegotiation of those divisions, I think is really hugely important. And I don't know how we're going to come out of it, but humanists obviously have to be speaking about this as historians, as art historians, as art critics, as anthropologists and commentators on culture in the anthropological sense, not the other sense. But we have to take seriously those challenges to elite culture without relinquishing our own confidence about the value of what we do. I don't know how this is going to resolve. If I did, I tell you, I have no idea. But it's very, very disturbing. But I would hope that humanists of all kinds would engage that topic and speak about it from the points of view of their own training and disciplines.
I think it's a privilege to be able to talk with those who've had the experience from, say, the 3,000 or 30,000 foot view on, say, the nation, at least, when we're in the trenches. I would love to know your perspective on what is the most effective way to make a case to convince those that are skeptical or who may judge the work, I mean, I'm going to be very specific, of curators, right, as relegated to the realm of the elite, or to see investment in the arts as a luxury and not a necessity. You use the word utility, and we need to do a better job at making the case. And so I've seen examples, say, from the arts and the humanities, for example, storytelling. Do we have good metaphors? Do we tell good stories about why this is valuable? On the social sciences side, I've seen the social impact of the arts study at UPenn with Professor Stern and Steiner, where they use numbers and data to show access to the arts increases education outcomes, decreases violence, etc. There are people who use a mantra, like I think of Thelma Golden, who is a phenomenal museum leader, and always uses the word service. Like, my work is in service to my audiences, artists, etc. What is the most strategic way, in your opinion, to make the case for our work?
Well, you asked that question, but I think you just also answered it. So, one of the things that we see on a very practical level, if we really want to be of service to the art itself, as well as to the community, as well as to humans with each other, is through stories. And I'm working as an arts advisor at PBS, and you will see, I'm not doing the actual shows, but we talk all the time about what can PBS do to really share that the arts belong to everybody, the arts and the humanities. And one of the things that we've arrived at are the stories, the behind-the-scenes stories, the stories that connect to people across the ways that the arts are expressed. And so I will have to say that as much as I had traveled, especially with the National Endowment for the Arts, and the many times that I had the opportunity to go behind the scenes in a museum, it was always to talk with a curator, and those curators are the ones who made me go running out with energy and inspiration, because you could tell me the context around an object. So it wasn't just an object. Look at this object, it's made with this and that and that, and that's important. But when you started telling me about why the object was created, it didn't have to be utilitarian, but it could be. Sometimes it was for the spiritual or the cultural bearing of a community. There's a lot of why behind it. There's a lot of context. That starts getting home with people, because we do share a lot more in common about those stories. And then we start saying, well, the arts aren't so bad just because my fourth grade teacher told me I couldn't draw, I must not be an artist. No, wait a minute, there's a level of creativity in there, and it was through the stories. The other thing that you also mentioned that I loved is sometimes they are shared through data. Sometimes they are shared through statistics and things like that. What I love about the arts and the humanities is that we have more of an opportunity, similar to what we talked about earlier in terms of listening, paying attention to the nuances. We have more of an opportunity to have more tools in our tool belt on how we connect with each other, because we don't have to, we can take pieces that seem disparate and we can synthesize them together and not feel like they have to fit in different categories. And that's a gift to be able to do that, because when somebody comes with a different learning style than, say, somebody else, you know which communication tool to pull out of your tool belt. And if it's somebody who thinks in terms of data, don't shun data. Say, I have actually the opportunity to talk about data more than most people do, and you can meet them where they are. So you really have been listening to their learning styles because you have been in the arts. So I would say you're right on time to be able to share that context. The one thing I have noticed is, and this is a sweeping generalization, you should never do these, but in sweeping generalization terms, I have noticed that it seems like the United States, let's just say United States versus China, since I seem to know those countries more than most, the United States seems to be lower in context, low context country, versus China, which seems to be a very high context country. Now, there are values and challenges to both. But if I delved into explaining it a little bit more, I would say the United States, if it were a low context country, it really is about that final product. It really is about the who won versus who lost. And there's value to that because you can be so focused, and it's very satisfying to be that focused and even delve to the depth. But the high context area is that you start realizing that we're all connected to each other. You start understanding the stories that connect us to each other. And so to be able to pull out the stories that curators know because of your collection or whatever it is you're trying to get across is a way that it connects us to each other. And I've learned that being in the midst of high context versus low context. It can be both, depending on what you pull out at the same time. So you've got a vast tool belt of tools that most people don't know about.
Yeah, context is an important concept. And I would just say in response, we have to go directly at those fractures and joints in the community, in the broad community, where we know these questions can be illuminated by the things that we know about. I'll give you a couple of examples. I read, as many of you did yesterday in the Times, one article about the UN report about biodiversity, the end of biodiversity, the challenges of biodiversity. And that's a great example of sort of a piece of contemporary life that has to be given illumination by the kinds of things that we know and do. It also is very helpfully one in which the scientific community shares a broad responsibility for educating all of us about what's happening. But the meaning of that is really something that we have to talk about. By talking, I mean curating about, writing about, thinking about, making films about, whatever humanistic expression or artistic expression you're talking about. When I was at NEH, we started in this particularly rough recent passage of race relations in the country. And, there is no possible way of understanding where we are in terms of race relations without understanding the history of the United States since the Civil War. You just can't grasp what's going on. Now, I don't mean that everybody's got to, go back to school, but we need to find ways of engaging people, and you as curators can do it, teachers can do it, professional writers can do it, in the context of what we're now going through. So I think you have to open up those places that we all know occupy a great deal of time and energy in the public sphere and go right at them. Go right at them. And curate and teach and write and make films about those things. And some of the work that you do, that others do, reach a huge amount of people. When I was at NEH, we funded Ken Burns' amazing series on the Vietnam War. 30 million people watched that film in the first week. So, these things have some impact because in some senses they have scale. scope. And what you do has scope, potentially, as well.
And on the other side to it, that's accurate. When I was at the National Endowment for the Arts, actually before I went to the National Endowment for the Arts, I was running a performing arts center in Kansas City, and I have a business degree too, and I would say to myself, what is that one program that we could put on that everybody would attend? Because it would be a lot more efficient, it would be a lot cheaper, that everybody likes. But that isn't how it works in the arts, certainly in the humanities as well. It's more like little enclaves of ways to connect people in smaller groups. And so when you come to the question of how do we make a case for this, I don't think you can make a case that says everybody's going to like that one thing and you will be force-fit to like it, and if you don't like it, that means you're wrong. And much more about that listening and the nuances of what pulls and connects people in together in smaller groups. So somebody in business might say, well, how could you do that? That's not very efficient. And of course, you're always in that creative tension. But there is a way to back up, and especially if you use success measures like broadening, deepening, and diversifying as much as economy. And you can say we brought in and we connected to people in the community we had not done before because of our approach to either storytelling or other approaches that you can help us learn about. I think that would be very satisfying too, and that would be success too. Big scale is good, small ways to connect with each other on a deeper relationship is also good.
How are we doing on time? We all right?
The iPad's supposed to turn yellow and then... Oh!
We have 13. Okay, how about some more questions? Yes, there's one right over there.
Thank you for this. And I'm running a very small non-profit based in Massachusetts, and we work between Vietnam and the US. And I constantly being advised that don't bother applying for the NEA or the big organization because it takes a lot of effort and it's not for you. So, and then I really inspired by Dr. Chu's talk about the small enclave things that connect, because we do a very, very important work, but it's in the kind of side of everything else. So how the NEA and the Mellons can create like a better way for small nonprofits like us to get into to get the funding to get things to be done. Thank you.
One of the things that we learned from other funders is that the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts, they viewed them as, if you got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities or the National Endowment for the Arts, they were more ready and open to say, okay, it's almost like a seal of approval or something. And the reason for that is some of it is that you have 12,000 pieces of paper to fill out. Don't even get me started on the 4 forms of 147 pages we filled out when we were applying for these positions. But there's just a lot of forms and things. But it leveraged approval from other funders. And it also is because in both of those organizations, there are panels of citizens who read the proposals first. And so if you've ever gotten a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities or the National Endowment for the Arts, it's a compliment to you, not just to get the grant, but it's a compliment because your peers have said, yeah, this is worth it. You know, we can see you getting a grant. So that part you can make a case for motivating to try to apply. I know at the National Endowment for the Arts, it was a privilege to be able to work with our staff, in particular our discipline directors, because they care so deeply about trying to find ways and explaining questions about government applications and things. And so I would say if you're just listening to people saying they have to jump through a lot of hoops, probably more hoops than most other funders, but talk to the staff and have them, they will walk you through, and they care so much about connecting people of organizations of all sizes, and they will guide you through the process and answer questions repeatedly until you hit submit, and then they're not allowed to do that anymore. But I'm so proud of what they had done to connect. I know I have an esteemed colleague here, Wendy Clark is here somewhere. We promised not to call you at 3 in the morning, but maybe you can meet up with Wendy. Where is Wendy? Yeah, maybe she can guide you through that process. So don't believe anybody without asking first and having your own experience of seeing if they really will talk to you, because they will.
Yeah, I'd second that. Don't give up. It is an arduous process, and we had a lot of conversations about that in both agencies. And it's still arduous. I'm sorry, but I wouldn't give up. The main thing I do is I would call. I mean, find the appropriate program and call the NEH and talk to them. They love talking on the phone, and I would suggest this to them. They really do. They like connecting with people out in the world whom they're serving in some sense. So I would call them and say, look, this is my organization, this is what we're doing. I think both agencies have gotten more and more sensitive to small and regional and sometimes just small town organizations because of the way sort of thinking about culture has changed. So I wouldn't be discouraged. I'd try, but I'd call first.
We heard many, many stories of small organizations in very remote places say that if it weren't for that NEA grant, we would not have gotten the next grant. Or it caused other people to say, okay, we'll consider you too. So try.
It's one right in the middle of it.
Hi, thank you for your comments on science and arts. Before being a museum curator, I founded an organization on art and climate change about 15 years ago. We did exhibitions, conversations in conjunction with UN climate change conferences in Copenhagen, in Paris, and so forth. Fast forward now, I work for a museum, and I started a collaboration with a national scientific research organization. I don't want to name them. But we started conversations, like a panel where you have scientists and artists doing conversations about scientific findings that influence or inspire artists. We started that last year. We want to continue this year. And I'm getting tremendous pushback to talk about certain issues, like climate change, and they don't want to get political. And I just sense there is tremendous fear, especially with national organizations, because I get it, funding and so forth, and we have climate change deniers in power right now. So I'm just wondering, what is your advice to connect with important scientific organizations and I would say particularly national organizations, because I really think that conversation is tremendously important. Science is very isolated, it's siloed, and it's not the same when you read about science, and you notice that when we did arts projects with artists who work with scientists, you have a completely different reaction. You have a gut reaction when you see something like that. So I'm just asking for your advice.
Well, thank you. It's a wonderful question. There's a new resource out, and it's a chance to brag about NEA and NEH. When we were kind of in the middle of our terms, we were approached by the National Academy for Science, Engineering, and Medicine about a study they wanted to do on the integration of science, technology, and the arts and humanities. The report, this is an advertisement, just came out. It came out a number of weeks ago. It's called Branches from the Same Tree. And it was headed by David Skorton, the Secretary of the Smithsonian. And it had a very, very interesting group of people working on it. We couldn't work on it because we were funders. But it's a very good report. And I don't say that often about these massive studies that come out of Washington. But this is really quite good. And it's got ideas for how you sort of make these integrations, because that's really what it's about. And I think it's one of the most exciting frontiers that's before us right now. It's the integration of the sciences and the technical disciplines with humanities and arts. And we have to get it right. We have to get it right. Because technology and science are generating forms of knowledge, forms of technology, forms of economic life that they themselves do not have perspective on, or can't have perspective on. And the environment's one of the great examples of that. Though environmental science is, absolutely fundamental to our ability to tackle this. So I would read that report and keep trying. As to the specter of this administration, denying climate change and putting pressure on agencies, that's undeniably the case. It's deeply regrettable, but it is the case. So you may find some tenderness in places like NEH and NEA, and NSF, I don't know if that's for NIH, about some of these issues. That will change, I think, with the change in administrations, and let's hope there's one soon. Because those questions really do need to be embraced by the federal agencies involved and by all of you in your institutions as well.
And to piggyback off of your Bro's comments and also your question of, what I hear in the question is, how do I make a case for this when it seems like the issue is so important? One thought, and I'm not sure I agree with what I'm about to say, but what's so great about what you have is a vision for what it can be and how your project can help communicate that vision as well. Sometimes, if they're along the process, it's valuable to find, you can keep the vision, so don't give the vision up, but you can find a step along the way that's not yet to the vision, it's on the way to the vision, that might be more soothing, that might be more a place where you can agree upon something with your partner who sort of kind of gets it but doesn't want to venture into it, and maybe that safety step can lead you to the next step. Sometimes that does work. Sometimes you just have to go, no, this is it, and we're going full guns right now, but sometimes it's the step along the way in the process that will lead you to what you don't want to give up, which is the ultimate vision. So maybe it's an approach.
We have time for one more. Yes?
Nick Apostolides.
Thanks for the introduction. Two personal questions. This is the last question for both of you. Bro, can you talk a little bit about, you taught in the classroom, you've also led universities, major institutions at the national level, so can you talk about where, to Jane's comment about that one-on-one kind of deeper learning, where, as you kind of look back over the last 20, 30 years, like where does the classroom experience fit for you? I think a lot of folks here also teach as well as curate, and so I'm just curious kind of where in your career the kind of meaning or substance that fits. And for Jane, we heard about your visual art, your fine art, your painting, drawing, so can you talk a little bit about where that fits? You're also a performing artist. Where do the visual arts fit within your own art practice? And since there are a bunch of creators in the room, have you ever shown your work?
She showed it to me. Well, like many people, I think, a lot of my interest in the humanities and my capacity in the humanities was formed in classrooms of various kinds. And I think in those, not exactly one-on-one, but small, intimate kind of engagements with faculty around texts, that's really where I was formed. And so it was hugely important for me. That's why I'm so worried in some ways about the stature of the humanities within the educational sphere, because those conversations, those introductions need to continue. And it's the source of the training all of you have, it's the source of the training I have. So we have to continue to pound away at this question of what is the role and place of the humanities and the arts in the educational sphere, and we have to remind people of the importance, and we have to keep insisting upon the centrality of those disciplines in the educational environments in which we live. Not least because it's the way we get perspective on technology and on science and all of the other flashy things that are going on. So preserving that educational space in a way that is particularly conducive to humanities work is hugely important.
Regarding my art, I love the visual arts. I'm actually classically trained in drawing and painting. I have an associate degree in that, but have not ever mentioned it too much. But now it's an opportunity. I love working at PBS because they share the same missions. We want to get across the nation. We want to connect people. We want people to help them find their identities and help them feel like they belong no matter where they are. And one of the ways to do it is through the arts. So you will see a lot of shows start talking about things like the stories behind the artist, the creative process, arts from everywhere. But I do work on my own pen and ink drawings, large format, and I'm developing my own portfolio. But I'm focusing on the products of the objects of immigrants. And so when you look at objects that belong to the stories of people who have immigrated here, it's far more related to their humanity than we realize, and we have a lot more in common. For example, I've got 25 medals that I'm drawing that belong to the son of the Chief of Staff of Haile Selassie, who he never met his father because his father was executed during a change of administration. But these medals are the only things he has to demonstrate his father's life that he never knew about. I'm drawing a 5-foot pen and ink, 5 foot, I'm 5'2", so that's 5, it's large pen and ink drawing of a tattered crocheted scarf that belonged to a woman whose mother was wearing it when she was taken to the gas chamber during the Holocaust. I mean, these stories of immigrants in our nation through the objects told is what I'm working on right now. So maybe in another year I'll have my portfolio developed. Well, thank you for
Thank you all very much.
For our breakout sessions. Lunch is at 12:45. We need to be back here at 2:30 for our afternoon panels. But the permanent galleries are open. You need to have your badge on to enter the permanent collection galleries because they are open just for us. There are curators and security guards throughout, but you need to have your badge on in order to access them. If you did not see Frida this morning, it is open, but it is ticketed and likely sold out. You can try to go down to the members' desk to purchase a ticket, but it is not open to us for free at our will. But it was generously open this morning, so I want you to take advantage of it. And that's about it. Got it all, Sharon? Good? Okay. Enjoy. And enjoy this really amazing